So before we start doing the scattering part of our tutorial, I would like to talk a little bit about the scattering itself. So as you know, usually you just pick your scatter objects, like basically your trees, and it's scattered randomly, which is not really how trees are scattered. So you usually get the clusters of trees because, well, you get the cluster of, let's say, pines, a cluster of alders, and they're just scattered as clusters. So when you pick the cluster option in Forest Pack, you will get a single tree scattered as cluster, meaning that you have two pine trees. You're gonna have two different clusters with the same object scattered. So if you have, let's say, 100-meter cluster, you will have 100 meters of the same exact tree, just rotated differently. And while from the far away it might not be noticeable, it really sometimes very visible. So how do we avoid that? Let's say we have two pine trees, three elder trees. How do we scatter them in clusters, but different trees of the same species should be on the same cluster? So for this we have the Forest Pack sets, and here I already created three of them, one for elms, one for alders, and one for pines. You just pick your meshes in there. And now in geometry you pick the Forest Pack set. Now as you can see, we have different trees of the same species scattered within the clusters. If you check the probability, because it's easier to distinguish them, those pine trees are very different sized, so you can see that we have both of them scattered in here, even though we only have one forest set object as 100% probability. Now another thing to do is, let's say you have a forest edge, the edge of your forest. So I'm just gonna draw forest very quickly. So let's say this is our forest edge. And your trees, that usually younger trees, are gonna be scattered at the edge of the forest, and older trees are gonna be more aback. So that means that their scale in the middle of the forest is gonna be bigger than the scale of the trees on the edge of it. And you can make this with the density and the scale curve. You just pick the value that you think would work for you, and that's it. And if you look at it from the horizon line, from the horizon perspective, you should see the nice fall off in their size. I'm usually creating the forest back base layer, where I'm putting there a lot of sub layers of my base objects. If I have base grass, so it's a grass layer, the trees, all of the objects that I'm gonna use for the scatter itself. So now I'm picking some grass from the Gauss library, and you can see I'm gonna bring it as geometry and make some clusters out of it, because the grass is pretty small, so we don't need billions of grass patches. So I'm gonna do a much bigger cluster to scatter all over the foreground, and I'm also not gonna scatter it everywhere. I'm just gonna scatter it on the frontmost foreground to save the resources. Then I'm gonna tweak the materials, and what I usually do is, usually it comes with double-sided material, and in latest V-Ray installments you have this thin-walled refraction method that you're switching the translucity to subsurface material, put the diffuse in the subsurface color, and it's basically the same as double-sided material, but as per Chaos, it's much lighter and renders a lot faster, so I'm using that. Now I'm just gonna make a new forest back layer for the foreground. I'm gonna draw some spline as an area where my grass is gonna be scattered. So as you can see, it's not crossing the entire landscape, just the foreground of the foreground. And I'm gonna tweak it a little bit, like it shouldn't go below the river. And it's extremely small, as you can see. There's also a chance that you're gonna exceed the limit. But once you go there, it's really getting heavy on your computer. So you should maybe make a bigger clusters. So that's what I'm gonna do. So as you can see, I'm making the shapes even smaller, because with this kind of shot, the smaller you go, the better, because there's a lot of objects to scatter, especially if it's grass and we're so high above. You could probably also just use the texture, a very frequent texture with a lot of noise, to fake the grass. But I also wanted some sort of irregularity in there, so I'm gonna make a bigger cluster, and I'm gonna do a bigger scale of the grass itself. So I'm just copying the same cluster, rotating it and combining them together. I'm just making more instances in the viewport just to check the scatter itself. And you can see I'm lowering it back a bit. Now I'm gonna use the noise to drive my scaling, because I want most of the grass to be smaller scale and just some patches to be bigger. So you can see I'm playing around with the low and high threshold to get the effect that I need. Now I'm gonna speed this up a lot, because I wanted to see if I can use one of the masks that we got from our terrain to drive the scattering of the grass itself, but at the end I decided that the basic scattering works the best, because it reduces the amount of grass that we have quite quite too much from the areas that I want it to be present. So I switched it back to no map. And what I'm looking for right now with our grass is the irregularity of the terrain. So I want it to look not just as a plain green material all over the place. I want it to be a patched grass, as to say. So I'm tweaking a little bit the noise. And now I'm optimizing the map for the forest pack, and it's not really optimizing it, it's just putting the forest pack color in the material itself. And somehow it's not always doing all of the materials properly, so you sometimes need to double check to see if it's done a good job or not. So now you can make some adjustments to the colors of each individual scattered object. Think of the scatter as a points scattered on top of the surface, kind of like particles, and each point gets the instance of the mesh that you picked. And each instance can be tinted inside of forest pack. And I'm gonna provide you those color textures that I used here to paint the grass. And I'm gonna do the same thing with the trees. So I'm gonna create a base tree layer. I'm gonna search for some trees in the Cosmos browser. I'm gonna bring them in. And it's the same species, it's just differently shaped trees. I'm gonna just create a basic, extremely basic forest pack for the trees. So I'm gonna use clustering, I'm gonna use a collision for them to not intersect. I'm just gonna tweak them a little bit. Their placement, their position, their randomness. And call it a day for the time being. Because we're just looking for the basic scatter to get us going. Now I'm gonna create the village itself, so I'm gonna take our base building mesh. And I'm gonna scatter them with TyFlow. You can probably do this multiple ways, like scattering with forest pack, or placing them by hand. You can use some arrays with the surface mod. But I love using TyFlow for this. Also, we need to extend the bounding boxes for the collision, so I find that TyFlow is really good for this. So I'm drawing the spline where my buildings are gonna be located. And you just put the building on top of them as position object. I'm doing the separation out of the particles and then spread them a little bit randomly. Then I'm rotating the building with the stepped rotation of 45 degrees. And I'm recasting the buildings onto the ground. Now I want to exclude the buildings under the river, so I'm doing the object test. I'm picking up the river, and everything that's below that is gonna get deleted. I'm always checking the inheritance of the material from the object itself. And I also don't want to include to have buildings on the slopes. So I'm using the normals as a test of the terrain to remove those buildings. And I'm going to use this as the exclude area for our scattered trees. I'm going to enlarge these buildings maybe 2 times, 2.5 times. And they're not going to be visible in their viewport. So as you can see, I'm doing 100% scale. I'm calling this bounding boxes so that they only affect the trees around, but we're not going to render them. And then we're going to have the actual buildings, which is pretty much the same except for the scale that is 100%, and the bounding box, I'm enlarging it to 150%. And now I want to fix the grass again because it just looks horrible to me. So I'm gonna do a bit larger clusters. And I'm just looking around to see if I can get something nicer in terms of randomness of the shape, randomness of the scale. So I'm scaling it not only on X and Y, but also separately on the Z axis, seeing if I can get something a little bit more random, something a little bit more patchy. And I'm gonna draw splines to exclude some trees from the hills. As per the concept art, there are some areas that don't have the trees, so we have to exclude those. I'm copying the trees forest back. And only affecting that hill so that we have a more precise control over the trees that we have in there. And I'm doing one more forest pack to get a little bit of extra grass in there. And I'm again doing the same trick with the noise that's driving the scale. You can see I'm getting there very wild with the numbers of the scale. And I'm trying to get a little bit different color variation on them so that we have different patches with different colors. I'm just offsetting this.